Yá'át'ééh, my relatives. Hello, this is Mark Charles. Today is Thursday, October 24th. It's the afternoon, about 1 o'clock DC time, Eastern time, but I'm still here with my second cup of coffee, and there's a few things I want to talk about. So I welcome you to grab your favorite cup of your morning or early afternoon beverage, and let's have a conversation. So before we begin, I want to do like I always do and acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from what's now called Washington, D.C. But these are the lands of the Piscataway. And so I want to honor the Piscataway as the hosts of the lands where I'm living. I want to thank the Piscataway for their stewardship of these lands and just state and remind myself how humbling it is to be living, walking, moving, breathing, making a living here on these lands today. So, Yá'át'ééh, my Piscataway relatives, thank you for your stewardship of these lands. We are quickly coming up on the end of October and going into the month of November, which is obviously coming up on Native American Heritage Month. We just had Indigenous Peoples Day like a week and a half ago. And so there's a lot of things going on within the Native community. Surprisingly, my travel schedule is not as busy as it normally is in November. I do have a few trips coming up, but normally my November is kind of packed back to back, and this year it's not. So I do have a trip coming up the middle of November where I will be in Alabama speaking at the University of Alabama in Birmingham at their medical department, talking about Indian health services as well as about the doctrine of discovery, Native culture, and in decolonizing health. And so that I don't think that lecture is public, but I will be speaking there. I'm also going to be traveling to Minneapolis. I'm going to be preaching at Calvary Baptist Church in Minneapolis on November 10th, which is a Sunday. And I will be there. I believe that service is at 10:30 in the morning. I'll obviously share more details about that as it gets closer. And I'm in the process of planning a trip to Seattle and the Seattle area. There are a few churches there who'd like me to preach, and one or a school that may want me to do some presentations. And so we're in the middle of kind of negotiating that and working those details out. And I'm doing the same thing with Minneapolis too. So once I have those details, I will share them with you more about some of my travel coming up in the next month or so. This weekend, I'm actually going to be traveling. I'm leaving on Saturday. I'm going to New Mexico. And I'm not speaking there, but I'm gathering with some friends and some colleagues of mine who are working on contextualizing worship for indigenous cultures, for specifically the Navajo culture. I met with this group regularly when I was living back on the reservation, and I'm now going back to spend some time with. They're having another one of their kind of quarterly meetings, and so I'm going to gather with them. And actually, I'm writing an article for a project on contextualized worship, and so I wanted to just go back and experience this again as I'm working on this article. So anyway, I will be back in New Mexico. I fly in on Saturday, and I'll be back in the Southwest, back on our Navajo Nation Sunday, Monday, and then I fly back here to DC on Tuesday. So anyway, what I want to talk to you about today, and let me see who's online with us here. Steve, Yá'át'ééh, thank you so much for joining. Russell, glad that you can be here. Yes, you are making a live session here, Russell. Glad you could join. I guess there is some benefits to me going on a little bit later in the day. And Donna, Yá'át'ééh, thanks for joining. Good to have you here with us today for this discussion. So this week, I read a lot of news articles, and I try to stay on top of what's going on in our world. And I like to read some more in-depth articles at times. And two of them kind of came across oh, Sonia, sorry, I didn't see you there. I just clicked on that accidentally. Yá'át'ééh, Sonia, good afternoon. Glad you could be here. Thanks for joining, Sonia. But I read two articles. One was an article in the New York Times. It was titled, it's actually the transcript from the Ezra Klein Show, which is a podcast. And it was published in the opinion section of the New York Times under the title, "What's Wrong with Donald Trump?" And I will share that article in the chat here if you would like to take a closer look at that. So let me put that there. And then there's another article that came across. It was in the LA Times, and this article was on baby food pouches. And the title of this article is "Kids Are Sucking Down Baby Food Pouches at a Record Rate, and We're Going to Pay for It, Experts Say," is the title of that article. And I want to talk for a moment about both of these articles. They seem a little disconnected, but at the end, I'm actually going to kind of tie them in a little bit into this election cycle and into some thoughts about Donald Trump especially. But yeah, so today we're talking about Donald Trump, and we're talking about about baby food pouches. So that is our discussion today. Let's go into the Trump article first, the opinion piece written in the New York Times, "What's Wrong with Donald Trump?" It's a longer article. It's about a 45-minute podcast to listen to it. It takes over half an hour to read it as well. And so it's a fairly long piece, but I found it very insightful, especially in the beginning, where the author of the article, Ezra Klein-Show, is kind of looking at Donald Trump, and he's talking about the dangers of kind of psychoanalyzing someone if you're not a psychologist and if they're not your patient and you can't examine them up close. But what many of us have observed is Donald Trump does portray many of the characteristics of narcissist and a lot of other challenges that he has. And those are fairly widely agreed upon, or there's a lot of people who are observing similar things in his behavior. What they point out in this op-ed, and he said he doesn't want to go into psychoanalyzing Donald Trump that specifically. He wants to look at kind of some broader categories, and he looks more closely at how, in general, most politicians have inhibitions, right? They're inhibited. And he talks about when you can tell almost the expertise or the professionalism of a politician by how well they are at inhibiting themselves. He kind of compares it to it's like a software filter that they have on their brains or over their mouths, where for those who are newer to the game, newer to politics, and they're in an interview, you can see them kind of centering themselves or inhibiting themselves as they're talking, and they will kind of stop, and you can see it happening kind of in real time. Then he says there's others, and he talks specifically, and I would agree with this assessment, of people like Pete Buttigieg and Bill Clinton and President Obama, Barack Obama, and they have their inhibitors are almost seamless. Like, they do it, but they talk in a way that it seems really authentic. And then he talks about Donald Trump. And he talks specifically about the rally Trump did this last week, or about a week ago, where there were two people who had some health emergencies during his event. And he stopped the event and put on his playlist and just stood there and swayed for like 30 minutes. I didn't watch it. I did hear about it. And he's like, he said, there was that event that gave him some of his insight into Donald Trump, because he said most politicians would never do that because of the backlash they would face over how foolish they looked, or why would a politician waste their time in the last few weeks running up to an election standing and swaying to their Spotify playlist at a rally. But he comments about how this is something Trump does with regularity. And the way he puts it, I want to just read. He says there's something undeniably electric to watch someone unchained from the bundle of inhibitions that the rest of us carry around. Watching someone just say it, speak what's on their mind, there is something aspirational about it. And he goes on to say, disinhibition is the engine of Trump's success. It is a strength. It is what makes him magnetic and compelling on a stage. It is what allows him to say things others would not say. It makes arguments to make arguments they would not make, to try strategies they would not try. Now, I'm not saying you have to like Donald Trump to agree with this, but he does get away with a lot of things, right? And he does have not only a lot of followers, but a lot of people who are aspiring to be like him, right? Think Ron DeSantis and Ted Cruz and others who he insults to their face, and yet they still praise him and want to be like him and try to mimic him and so on and so forth. And so I found it really fascinating as he went, and I encourage you to read the article, as he went through and kind of built his case of why Donald Trump's lack of inhibition is something that he does very well and has used it to his political advantage throughout his campaign. Not only this campaign, but through the campaign back in 2016 when he first ran for office, and then also obviously going into now. He goes on in the article to say, and I'm going to read this to you, Trump moves through the world without the behavioral inhibitions that most of us labor under. And when I say that, I am describing both what is wrong with Donald Trump and what is right with him. Something I have learned as I've gotten older is that every person's strengths are also their weaknesses. And so he talks throughout the article about how, yes, Donald Trump has used his inhibitions as a strength, but it also is one of his weaknesses. He uses the example where he kind of mocked John McCain and said he likes war heroes who don't get captured, and he says things that are very regrettable and even end up hurting him. And then he goes on to talk about Donald Trump's presidency and some of the attacks on Trump. And he addresses the Democratic Party a bit more directly. And he says, here's the question that Democrats have floundered in answering this year. If Trump is so dangerous, right, and Democrats are painting Trump as this incredible danger, then how come the consequences of his presidency, his previous presidency, were not worse than they were? And he answers that and says, the answer to this question is that as president, Trump was surrounded by inhibitors. And he gives a lot of examples, including how in 2020, the political scientist Daniel Dresner published a book titled The Toddler in Chief. And the book contained over 1,000 instances in which Trump is described by those around him in terms befitting an impetuous child. And he gives several examples in the article about how Trump was literally like interacting with a child or with a child in office. And he talks about how it was a lot of the not career politicians, but career governmental workers, people who weren't there just to support the Trump candidacy or presidency, but who are career federal employees who acted as inhibitors to kind of control Donald Trump. And because of that, because of those, what I would say were valiant efforts to be the inhibitor for Donald Trump, it's why the consequences of his impulses were not worse, and they didn't get played out the way he either wanted to play them out or the way that he had hoped they would play out. And then he kind of ends the article with talking about how the way those in the Trump campaign and the Trump orbit, including his sons, are working to make sure that if he wins a second presidency, those people, those inhibitors, are not going to be there anymore. They're not going to be able to inhibit Trump the way they did in his first term in office. It's a long article, and it's a podcast, 45 minutes. I found it very insightful, and I found it interesting to read, and it was kind of a perspective on Trump that you don't hear really often. And it caused me to think about not only um, who he is as a politician, but what are some of the more lurking dangers about him? And so, if you have a chance, I encourage you to read that article. It's an interesting article. Um, One of the things that the article said, and he's talking more specifically about Trump. I want to read this to you. He says Trump does not see beyond himself and what he thinks and what he wants and how he's feeling. He does not listen to other people. He does not take correction or direction. Wisdom is the ability to learn from experience, to learn from others. Donald Trump doesn't really learn. He once told a biographer, when I look at myself in the first grade and I look at myself now, I'm basically the same. The temperament is not that different. And this is what I said. I forget where I was. Might have been my other second cup of coffee last week, where I talked about. Oh no, it was on my Q&A I did in Patreon, and I was being asked about this election, and I was talking about Donald Trump, and I said one of the things I see as a real danger of Donald Trump is that he is not intellectually curious. Right? He thinks what he thinks. He knows what he thinks he knows, and that's all he needs. He's not interested in learning or in understanding new things or in educating himself. He literally has no interest in that, and I think that is what makes him dangerous as a global leader. Right? Is someone who is not interested in learning new things or seeing new things or understanding new things. And so then to hear in this article, he talked about one of the things Trump does is, and even Trump acknowledges, is his temperament. He still has the same temperament that he had as a first grader. And I can see that, right? The way Donald Trump behaves, the way he conducts himself, the way he demands things, the way he acts in public. He does. He reminds, and this goes back to the other comments in that article, is, yeah, he reminds us of how a child responds, how a child reacts. And even according to the article, as well as to apparently the book by Daniel Dresner, a lot of people who left the Trump campaign or left the Trump White House, they left because they were tired of babysitting a child. And that's what they found they were doing most of the time. And so, yeah, I found that is a very interesting. And when you look at Trump, he does not appear interested in learning or understanding new things. He knows what he knows, and he understands what he understands, which really is not that much. He's not a very curious person, and he just acts on his gut. And he has the temperament. He agrees as a child. His temperament has not changed since he was a first grader. And that's one of the things that's really dangerous about him. Now, so there's that article. Now let's talk about the second article that I read in the LA Times about kids who are sucking down baby food pouches at record rates. And again, I read these two articles as separate. I read this one article in the New York Times about Trump, and it gave me insight into Trump, and it gave me a kind of a new way to think about his presidency and his candidacy, and some of the threats we may face if he does get elected again. And then I saw this other article, and it came across. I forget where I was. I was on the LA Times website, I think, and I came across it, and it talked about how baby food pouches are becoming really popular. And not just for babies, but they're becoming really popular for young kids as old as 5, 6, and 7, maybe even older. And families are buying these baby food pouches, which are basically, liquefied food, vegetables, meats, fruits, that can be eaten with no mess, kind of sucked like a smoothie or a Slurpee out of this pouch. And it's a great no mess way to feed your kids and to feed especially young toddlers and young children. And they're growing in increasing popularity. And the reason this caught my eye is because of all of the research I've been doing on health and especially on breathing, and how the dangers of ultra processed foods, one of the dangers of ultra processed food, besides the fact that they're loaded with sugar, they're loaded with sodium, they're loaded with all their ultra processed ingredients, and they're not natural. But on top of that, they're incredibly soft, right? Whether it's a hamburger from McDonald's or a baby food pouch from the grocery store, you don't have to chew ultra processed food very much to get it down. That's why you can inhale a Big Mac in just a few bites. That's why, right? That's why parents love these pouches, because you can suck them down without making a mess, without getting crumbs all over, without, there's no chewing, no choking, right? It's a very easy way to feed your young children. And because of our ultra processed food, and this comes from the book Breath I read a few months ago by James Nestor, right? When they look back over the history of kind of the development of processed foods and ultra processed foods, they saw that as societies, going back to Europe and here, including here in the United States, as societies and cultures had more access to processed and ultra processed foods, meaning we had to chew less. We ate less whole foods. We ate less crunchy foods. We ate things off the bones less, and so on and so forth. Our mouths got smaller. Our sinuses got smaller. Our breathing became more labored, and we began having more crooked teeth. And then looking at the book you've heard me reference before by George Catlin, who was comparing when he went into the same lands that Lewis and Clark explored a few years later, and he met with Native nations there and met with Native peoples there, wasn't going to discover them or to subjugate them, but was just to meet them and to learn them and to meet them and to understand them and to kind of get to know these peoples and their nations. He observed that most Native peoples were healthier, they got sick less, they were stronger, they had almost perfectly straight teeth as compared to the very crooked teeth of white Americans, and they were adamant about breathing through their noses. And right, and so he talked about how the health of Native peoples, because they were eating whole foods, and they were not eating these processed foods that Americans were eating, they were much healthier, and their mouths were stronger, and all these other positive implications for them. And so I've been thinking a lot about that as I've worked hard to feed my family more healthy foods, and as I've been working hard to myself eat more whole foods. I'm not just like eating apples and peaches and bananas, but not cutting them up first, just actually crunching into an apple, biting into an apple and biting into a peach, and eating carrots whole and not cutting them up first, right? In just crunching on foods more as a way to continue to work my mouth and to help my own breathing. And then also trying to eat less processed foods. And so that's what led me to read this article. And one of the things I found about this article is it talked about how it was even kind of causing an aversion in these kids, and not just in toddlers, but as they were growing older, 5, 6, and 7 years old, and still eating these baby food pouches multiple times a day. Some of these kids were actually having an aversion to chewing, and they were having an aversion to eating whole foods and actually eating real foods. And right, the article didn't even talk about the impact that it has on our breathing, and it has on our crooked teeth, and it has on all these other things. It talked just about the fact that it was eating more processed foods. And so they said, if you're going to buy these things for your kids, make sure they're made with more actual food instead of ultra processed food and unnatural ingredients. But even eating ground up or blended real food, you're still not chewing it. And so it just made me think, how much worse is our health going to get, right? What impact is this explosion of baby food pouches that we're seeing happen right now? How is that going to impact the overall health of this next generation as they grow up even more removed from eating actual whole foods that need to be chewed and that our bodies and people have been chewing for hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. And so, yeah, it made me think about all of these implications of what we're doing to our health and to our bodies. So I encourage you to read that article. And if you follow me on social media, you'll notice that yesterday I posted this onto my Facebook page. And let me put the image up here. I want to tie these things together. So I posted this on my Facebook page yesterday. I said, it confounds me that our politicians are tripping over themselves to prove that they are the candidate most closely aligned with a massive multinational corporate fast food chain that has made hundreds of billions of dollars by selling us highly processed fast foods, which contribute greatly to our nation's epidemic rates of obesity, high blood pressure, and diabetes. And what I was referring to is this competition that Vice President Harris and Donald Trump are having over who's most closely aligned with McDonald's, right? Vice President Harris frequently mentions that she worked at McDonald's and she had a job there when she was growing up, and Trump therefore went and worked at a McDonald's last week, and he served up some fries, and he bragged that he knows the McDonald's menu better than the employees do. And it's quite ridiculous thinking about it. But right, it's like both of them are trying to say, hey, we can relate to you because we both worked at and are familiar with this restaurant that is mostly associated with lower classes and average everyday people. But there was no discussion in either of their campaigns about how restaurants like McDonald's and fast food restaurants in general, and sodas and processed foods and highly processed foods and all these other things are literally destroying the health of our nation, causing thousands and thousands of deaths through diabetes and heart attacks and high blood pressure and all the other things that they do to our health. And they're not having that discussion. These are the two people who are trying to lead our nation. And they're more concerned about looking like the person who works at McDonald's and understands McDonald's than saying there is a deep problem with the fact that McDonald's is the restaurant we all relate through, right? It's restaurants like McDonald's that are literally helping to destroy the health of our nation. And that's not even a part of the discussion. And that's something that really bothers me about where our politics are going right now. And politicians want to seem like they can relate to us, but they're not acknowledging that, yeah, how they want to relate to us is through this restaurant that's literally killing us. Right? It's literally causing incredible damage to our health. And we're not talking about that. I'm reading a book right now. It's called Good Energy. It's another book on health. I've read a lot of these books in the past year. And you've heard me talk about the Ultra Processed People book that I've read and other books on different aspects of health. And you have to read all of these books with with an understanding of every book is going to have their one thing, right? Their They're almost all written by white people, and they're like, I found the one thing, I've discovered the one thing. If we just do this, if we just sleep more, if we just move more, if we just stop eating oils, or we start eating this, or we stop doing this, or we start doing that, then everything's going to be perfect. You'll be rich, you'll be healthy, you'll be beautiful, and blah, 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 right? They all have their one thing. And so you have to read these. You actually have to read multiple books to get a much bigger picture of it all. And you have to kind of read them with an understanding of, yeah, no one book is going to have all the answers. But I've been reading this book, Good Energy, and one of the things that this book says is going to solve all of our problems is the fact that we can have things like Fitbits and things on our wrists and our bodies that monitor our health and help track our sleep. And if we can just all do that better, we'll be much healthier. And I don't disagree, and this book is a little more comprehensive than most, but it's not completely disconnected. And I'm also reading another book right now called The Case Against Sugar. And this book is giving me an understanding about how sugar has become this kind of ubiquitous food throughout Western culture, both in Europe and in America, and now it's being spread out globally, and how it's literally destroying our health. And the more you read of these books, the more they all kind of, something you see in a lot of these books is how they all point to the systemic problems we face as a nation, and our nation's lack of desire, our lack of courage to legislate these dangerous types of foods, ultra processed food, are to control companies and the way that they advertise and they sell these foods and make them so readily available. And it really is a very deep and systemic problem, not unlike the race problem that we face in our nation, right? The more you research race and the more you look at our nation's history and the doctrine of discovery and all this stuff, the more you realize how deeply this stuff is embedded into the foundations of our nation. And I don't disagree. At times it feels overwhelming. How do you begin to unravel all of those things? And the same thing is true, especially with our nation's chronic health problems, coming from the foods we eat and our lack of our incredibly sedentary lifestyles, right? These are problems that didn't just come because we all made personal choices. They came through some very systemic ways. And our countries, our government's lack of courage to legislate corporations and businesses that were developing and then using these things. And so the problems are really deeply systemic as to why we don't wrestle with them. And I think that's one reason why neither Donald Trump nor Vice President Harris are talking about the dangers of eating too much at McDonald's, right? Because that involves taking on a very powerful processed food and fast food and soft drink and all these other lobbies that back this industry and that pour hundreds of millions of dollars into our political system. And to prove that point, I want to go back to President Obama and Michelle Obama's work and this was Michelle Obama's work as First Lady. And I'm not criticizing her desire, right? She started this Let's Move campaign. And the goal was to address the fast food and the way it's marketed to kids, and to address the challenge we have in our diet and in our lack of movement and in the obesity, especially among our children and our youth. And I'm posting two articles here because they will show you two different sides of the coin. The first article is a bit more critical, and it's from Think Progress, and it's titled "How Big Food Corporations Watered Down Michelle Obama's Let's Move campaign." The second article by Vox is more positive. It says, "How Michelle Obama Quietly Changed What Americans Eat." The first article is written from a much more critical standpoint. The second one is written from a much more positive standpoint. But they both actually point out the same thing, which is just like President Obama learned when he first came into office that you don't confront the myth of American exceptionalism. And he came in kind of critiquing and challenging the myth of American exceptionalism. And by the time he left office, he was praising American exceptionalism and using that in his writings and his speeches, and he was promoting it more than and better than most other presidents were doing in the first place. And the same thing, right? When Michelle Obama started in office, she was really looking to challenge more legally and legislatively what was going on. And throughout her time in office, her time as First Lady and her working on this campaign, it moved further away from legislation and much more towards personal choice and behavior. And the reason it moved that way is because of the fast food lobby, right? Which actually, I said they increased their spending by like around $100 million, I think, over the years. And it obviously was seen as a threat. And so even in the Vox article, it talked about how the first article in Think Progress, it paints very clearly how the Let's Move campaign moved from legislative solutions more towards personal choice and behavior changes. And then the second article even had several sentences where it acknowledged, right? It at one point talked about the shrewd choice that the campaign made of promoting water instead of attacking big soda, right? And again, it's moving from legislative solutions to behavioral solutions. And I'm not saying we need only one, right? But we do need both. And obviously the corporations would rather have us focus on behavioral changes because that doesn't demonize them. And so they're going to push more towards, well, let's just let us regulate ourselves, which is what happened in a lot of cases. And so it points out how the two articles both end up pointing out how, yeah, the Let's Move campaign did get watered down because of the way these powerful lobbies were opposed to legislative solutions, because they didn't want anything that would legally limit or legislatively limit their behaviors or their actions. And more, they just promised to behave better and to be more conscientious. And if you, again, the more you read these books I've been reading, the more you see how that allows them to actually shape these ideas more rather than actually be controlled and be limited by them. And so, yeah, when I was thinking through these two articles, are these articles about food pouches and about the way our ultra processed food is having a very detrimental effect on our health. And then I look at how both of our candidates are trying their hardest to align themselves with McDonald's, of all companies at the moment. And neither one of them is talking very strongly or directly about how it's restaurants like McDonald's that are actually contributing, not just to our bad health, but to literally the death of untold numbers of people in our country dying from these complications of these chronic diseases. And we're not having that discussion. And that's the discussion I feel like we need to have. Right? I'm not saying that Donald Trump won't be destructive if he gets into office. I actually believe he will try to be as destructive as he possibly can, and may even be more successful than he was in his bad behavior in a second term than he was in his first term. And I'm not denying that's not a real threat that we have to wrestle with and that we need to take into account as to who we're going to vote for. But I also want to remind us that we are facing some other very real challenges as a nation, including our epidemic rates of obesity and high blood pressure and diabetes and all these other chronic diseases that are killing us daily. And neither one of these parties seem interested in addressing that and in trying to fix that. And that's the problem. That's the problem. They would rather fight over issues that they can demonize one party for and not the other, instead of looking at what are these challenges we face as a whole, as a nation, that are having some very real and dire consequences today that neither group is willing or has the courage or the ability to address. So anyway, that's how I connected Donald Trump and baby food pouches. And I know we're getting close to the election. It's just a few weeks away, and people need to be making decisions about who they're going to vote for and who they want to support. And I really want to just continue to challenge people to think through these issues at some very deep levels, and even don't just think through the issues that the candidates are talking about, but think through what are the challenges we're facing as a nation that the candidates are not talking about. And what do we need to do to try and change and address these challenges? And again, I appreciate what Michelle Obama did with her Let's Move campaign and the way she tried to address issues of obesity and other health concerns, especially for our children. But I also need to point out there was a bending of the will there, and it did not take on the powerful lobbies and the things that are behind so many of these problems. And instead, it only focused on one side of the issue, which made it much more politically palatable and had less energy to make and enact and therefore move real systemic change. And if we're going to solve these problems, we need the ability to do both. We need to inspire people to make better choices and to live differently. We also need the strength to stand up and look at, and I'm going to say it, look at white landowning men, right? Who do you think runs these corporations? Look them in the eye and say, no, just because you're wealthy and rich and have tons of money and can donate all this millions of dollars, billions of dollars to these campaigns, you still need to be held accountable. You cannot have free reign. Corporations are not interested in the public welfare of our country beyond the fact that we're their consumers. And so we have to address, yes, we need to help our people make better choices. But we also need to control white landowning men who truly feel, act, and behave like they can act with impunity just because they're wealthy and they have power. And the problem is our system wasn't designed to hold them accountable, right? Trump found that out. Why do you think he's not in jail yet? We don't have a criminal justice system designed to hold white landowning men accountable. I promise you, if he was Black or Native, he would absolutely be in jail today. I have no doubt about that in my mind whatsoever. But because he's a white landowning male from the upper echelons of the 1%, our system was not designed to hold him accountable. Anyway, those are my thoughts, my relatives. I appreciate your willingness to engage with me on these topics. Thank you for taking some time. I hope that your second cup of coffee is as good as mine is. And I'm traveling this weekend, but I'll be back next week, and hopefully next week, Wednesday or Thursday, I'll do another second cup of coffee. And I want to continue to talk about politics as we're getting closer to the election. But yeah, I encourage you to continue to think very critically. Um, and what do we need to really focus on in this election? Not just what is the most immediate not what are the parties telling us is the most immediate political challenges, but what are the long-term and the more systemic challenges that we're facing that we need to also make sure that we're keeping in the forefront of our minds as we think about who to vote for and how to vote. My relatives, I hope you have a great day. I appreciate all of you. Walk in beauty, and may we all learn how to walk in beauty together. Yá'át'ééh and Hako'onet.